In the early Cold War, large-scale military exercises were conceived primarily as tools for training, readiness testing, and signaling resolve. But as the strategic environment hardened and intelligence competition intensified, these exercises evolved into complex arenas where observation, deception, and interpretation became as important as maneuver and firepower, transforming them into inadvertent intelligence traps for both the forces conducting them and the adversaries observing from afar. This transformation emerged gradually as intelligence services recognized that exercises generated unusually dense concentrations of actionable information, including force deployment patterns, command relationships, communication procedures, logistical capacity, and decision-making tempo, all of which could be collected without the risks associated with clandestine penetration. Unlike wartime operations, exercises were planned in advance, executed repeatedly, and often partially visible by design, creating predictable windows in which adversaries could study behavior under controlled but realistic conditions. Intelligence analysts quickly understood that exercises revealed not only what militaries wanted to demonstrate, but also what they took for granted, exposing assumptions embedded in doctrine, command culture, and operational planning that were rarely articulated explicitly. Early examples showed that even tightly scripted exercises leaked information through routine behaviors, such as how quickly units mobilized, how command centers processed information, and how political authorities interacted with military leadership during simulated crises. These observations allowed adversaries to build detailed models of escalation behavior, response thresholds, and internal coordination without firing a shot. As the Cold War progressed, both blocs institutionalized systematic monitoring of each other's exercises, treating them as recurring intelligence collection, opportunities rather than isolated events, and dedicating analytic teams to comparing exercise behavior across years to detect change, innovation, or deterioration. This longitudinal approach transformed exercises into baselines against which real-world behavior could later be measured, making them central to intelligence assessment rather than peripheral. Military planners gradually became aware that exercises were being exploited in this way, but the need to train forces realistically limited their ability to conceal behavior entirely, creating a structural vulnerability that could not be eliminated without degrading readiness. Attempts to mask intentions through scripted scenarios, artificial constraints, or deliberate deception often generated additional intelligence signals as adversaries learned to distinguish between genuine capability and performative behavior by comparing exercises against known operational requirements. Exercises thus became double-edged instruments, simultaneously reassuring allies, signaling resolve, and exposing internal mechanics to adversary scrutiny. The intelligence trap aspect emerged most clearly when exercises revealed discrepancies between doctrine and practice, as planners discovered that written plans often diverged from how forces actually behaved under simulated stress, providing adversaries with insight into likely real-world performance. Command and control exercises were particularly revealing, as they exposed decision-making hierarchies, delegation practices, and the extent to which political leaders remained involved during simulated escalation, information of immense value to adversaries seeking to understand crisis dynamics. Communication drills likewise offered intelligence dividends, as monitoring transmission volume, redundancy, and recovery procedures allowed observers to infer resilience and vulnerability within command networks. Logistical exercises revealed sustainment capacity, bottlenecks, and mobilization depth, undermining attempts to portray strength through sheer numbers alone. Intelligence services exploited these signals by integrating exercise observation with other collection streams, using open activity to cue more sensitive assets and to validate assessments derived from signals intelligence, imagery, and human reporting. Over time, exercises ceased to be treated as neutral or benign and instead became contested spaces in which both sides attempted to learn while limiting what could be learned about themselves. This dynamic introduced a new layer of strategic interaction, as planners weighed the training value of realism against the intelligence cost of exposure, often accepting leakage as unavoidable, but seeking to manage its impact through repetition, ambiguity, and selective transparency. By the late 1950s, the intelligence trap inherent in military exercises had become an accepted feature of Cold War competition, shaping how exercises were designed, observed, and interpreted, and embedding intelligence considerations directly into what had once been purely military training events. This development marked the beginning of a long evolution in which exercises functioned not only as rehearsals for war, but as ongoing intelligence exchanges conducted in plain sight, laying the groundwork for increasingly complex interactions between readiness, signaling, and espionage that would define Cold War military behavior for decades. As the Cold War entered the 1960s, military exercises increasingly became deliberate instruments of intelligence interaction rather than accidental sources of information leakage, as both superpowers recognized that exercises could be used to probe adversary perception, test intelligence collection capacity, and observe how rivals interpreted ambiguous activity under conditions short of war. This recognition altered how exercises were planned and executed, as scenarios were designed not only to train forces, but to generate observable behavior that could signal readiness, restraint, or resolve, while simultaneously tempting adversaries into over-interpretation or miscalculation. Intelligence services on both sides began to treat exercises as controlled experiments, carefully monitoring how much attention they attracted, what collection methods were activated in response, and how quickly adversary assessments adjusted, using these reactions to map intelligence priorities and analytic assumptions. This feedback loop transformed exercises into intelligence traps in two directions, as planners sought to learn from adversary observation while also risking exposure of their own capabilities and limitations. The intelligence value of exercises expanded as monitoring technologies improved, allowing adversaries to track troop movements, radar activation patterns, communication density, and logistical flow with increasing precision, turning large-scale maneuvers into rich data sets that could be mined long after the exercise concluded. Analysts compared successive exercises to identify trends, deviations, and anomalies, treating changes in tempo, scale, or command structure as indicators of evolving doctrine or internal stress. At the same time, intelligence agencies recognized that exercises often revealed what militaries could not easily change, such as geography, infrastructure dependence, and organizational habits, making them especially valuable for long-term planning. Military planners responded by attempting to manage what exercises revealed, introducing scripted elements, artificial pauses, and controlled messaging intended to shape adversary interpretation without compromising training value. Yet these efforts frequently generated new intelligence signals by highlighting which aspects of behavior were considered sensitive enough to obscure. Command post exercises became particularly important in this context, as they exposed decision-making processes, delegation thresholds, and interaction between political and military authorities under simulated crisis conditions, allowing adversaries to infer how real escalation might be managed. Intelligence observers focused not only on outcomes, but on timing, noting how long it took for commands to be issued, approvals granted, and units repositioned, because delays and accelerations alike revealed internal constraints. Communication exercises offered similar insight, as patterns of redundancy, fallback procedures, and recovery drills indicated the resilience of command networks under stress, information critical for understanding adversary confidence and vulnerability. Exercises involving reserve mobilization and logistics were especially revealing, as they demonstrated how quickly forces could transition from peacetime posture to wartime readiness, exposing bottlenecks that doctrine alone could not conceal. Intelligence traps emerged most dangerously when exercises were misread as preparations for real attack, as ambiguous movements, heightened alert levels, or unusual force concentrations could trigger reciprocal responses, compressing decision timelines and increasing the risk of escalation. This risk forced political leaders to balance the training and signaling value of exercises against the intelligence and stability costs they imposed, leading to internal debates over scale, timing, and transparency. Some exercises were deliberately announced or framed diplomatically to reduce misinterpretation, while others were kept opaque to maximize intelligence probing, reflecting different strategic objectives. Adversaries, for their part, learned to watch not only the exercise itself, but the surrounding political and diplomatic behavior, using contextual cues to judge intent and calibrate response. Intelligence services became central intermediaries in this process, translating exercise observation into assessments that informed policy decisions, reinforcing the role of intelligence as both observer and participant in the exercise dynamic. By the mid-1960s, military exercises had become recurring intelligence battlegrounds in which both sides sought advantage without crossing the threshold into conflict, embedding espionage, signaling, and risk management into routine military activity. This evolution underscored that exercises were no longer insulated from strategic competition, but were instead integral to it, functioning as periodic tests of perception, preparedness, and restraint, whose intelligence consequences could rival those of real-world crises. The intelligence trap inherent in exercises thus deepened, as each iteration generated new data, refined adversary understanding, and shaped expectations for future behavior, locking both sides into a cycle of observation and adaptation that would intensify rather than diminish as the Cold War progressed. As the late 1960s moved into the early 1970s, the intelligence trap created by military exercises became increasingly institutionalized, as both blocs accepted that exercises were unavoidable points of exposure and sought to manage, rather than eliminate, the intelligence consequences of realistic training. This acceptance led to a more calculated use of ambiguity, as planners deliberately designed exercises that could be interpreted in multiple ways, forcing adversaries to reveal their analytic assumptions through the conclusions they drew and the responses they initiated. Intelligence services paid close attention not only to physical movements, but to how adversaries framed exercises internally and publicly, using diplomatic statements, media posture, and alert measures as indicators of threat perception and confidence. This interpretive dimension turned exercises into probes of adversary psychology as much as military capability, allowing states to test whether rivals were inclined toward caution, alarmism, or opportunism under uncertainty. The intelligence value of exercises expanded further. Command and control complexity increased because large maneuvers required coordination across services, regions, and political authorities, exposing seams where friction, delay, or miscommunication could be observed. Analysts learned to identify which commands exercised real authority during drills and which functioned primarily as conduits, providing insight into internal hierarchies that were rarely visible outside simulated crisis. Exercises involving nuclear-capable forces were particularly sensitive, as they blurred the line between training and signaling. And intelligence observers scrutinized alert levels, dispersal patterns, and command participation to infer escalation thresholds. Political leaders became increasingly involved in approving and monitoring such exercises, recognizing that misinterpretation could provoke reciprocal action and compress decision timelines dangerously. This involvement itself generated intelligence signals, as the presence or absence of senior leadership during drills suggested how tightly political control was maintained under simulated stress. Attempts to conceal sensitive aspects of exercises often produced unintended intelligence dividends, as deviations from established patterns drew attention to precisely those elements planners wished to hide, reinforcing the difficulty of controlling what exercises revealed. Deception measures introduced to obscure intent frequently required additional coordination and communication, creating observable anomalies that intelligence analysts could exploit. Over time, adversaries developed heuristics for interpreting exercises, distinguishing routine training from behavior that suggested doctrinal change or heightened readiness. And these heuristics were refined through repeated exposure, making each exercise part of a cumulative learning process. This cumulative effect meant that even minor adjustments in exercise design could have outsized intelligence impact if they broke from established precedent, highlighting the long memory of intelligence systems. Exercises also became opportunities for validating intelligence collection capabilities, as states monitored which assets were activated in response, how quickly data flowed through analytic channels, and whether assessments aligned with actual exercise parameters, using this information to refine both collection and counter-collection strategies. The risk of miscalculation remained ever present, as exercises could still be misread despite precautions, and intelligence services were tasked with providing reassurance and context to political leaders to prevent overreaction. This mediating role underscored the dual nature of intelligence during exercises, as it both exploited the intelligence trap and sought to mitigate its most dangerous consequences. By the early 1970s, the intelligence dimension of military exercises had become inseparable from their training function, shaping decisions about scale, frequency, and scenario selection. Planners increasingly recognized that exercises were among the few moments when adversary forces, intelligence systems, and political leadership interacted indirectly but simultaneously, making them uniquely informative, yet uniquely risky. This recognition did not diminish the use of exercises, but it imposed a discipline of anticipation, as each maneuver was evaluated not only for its training value, but for the intelligence signals it would emit and the reactions it might provoke. The intelligence trap thus matured into a stable feature of Cold War military practice, embedding observation, interpretation, and risk management into routine activity and reinforcing the reality that even rehearsals for war could generate consequences nearly as significant as war itself. As the mid-1970s unfolded, military exercises increasingly functioned as intelligence traps, not only because of what they revealed, but because of how they structured adversary decision-making under uncertainty, as repeated exposure to ambiguous maneuvers conditioned analysts and political leaders to rely on exercise behavior as a proxy for intent, thereby elevating the strategic significance of routine training activity. Intelligence services on both sides devoted substantial resources to distinguishing genuine doctrinal change from performative signaling, recognizing that exercises could be used deliberately to normalize behaviors that would otherwise appear escalatory, such as large-scale mobilization, rapid redeployment, or heightened alert procedures. This normalization effect was itself an intelligence outcome, as repeated observation reduced surprise and shaped expectations, allowing states to test how far they could push activity without provoking alarm. Planners exploited this dynamic by introducing incremental changes across successive exercises, enabling adversaries to absorb adjustments gradually and revealing tolerance thresholds through the reactions, or lack thereof, that followed. Exercises thus became tools for mapping adversary sensitivity, identifying which movements triggered heightened collection, diplomatic protest, or reciprocal readiness measures, and which passed with minimal response. Intelligence analysts treated these reactions as data points, integrating them into assessments of adversary risk tolerance and escalation behavior. The intelligence trap deepened as exercises expanded in scope and complexity, incorporating joint and combined operations that required coordination across services and, in some cases, allied forces, exposing seams in interoperability, command authority, and logistical integration that adversaries could exploit. Exercises involving allied participation were particularly revealing as they exposed the degree of cohesion, standardization, and trust within alliances, allowing observers to assess whether collective defense commitments were backed by operational reality. Intelligence services monitored not only military behavior, but also political messaging surrounding exercises, noting how governments framed their purpose domestically and internationally, and whether rhetoric aligned with observed activity, using discrepancies to infer internal debate or uncertainty. The role of media coverage became an additional layer of the intelligence trap, as public statements, controlled leaks, and press access were used to shape perception, yet also provided adversaries with insight into what planners wanted to emphasize or conceal. Attempts to manage media narratives often revealed sensitivity around particular capabilities or scenarios, inadvertently drawing attention to areas of concern. Exercises conducted near contested regions or along alliance boundaries carried heightened intelligence value as they tested response mechanisms under conditions approximating real crisis geography, allowing adversaries to observe reaction times, reinforcement pathways, and coordination across distance. These observations informed contingency planning, enabling more accurate modeling of how forces might behave in real conflict. The intelligence trap was further reinforced by the repetitive nature of exercises, which allowed analysts to identify habitual behaviors and institutional routines that persisted despite changes in doctrine or leadership, revealing organizational inertia that could constrain wartime adaptation. Military planners became increasingly aware of this scrutiny, yet found it difficult to alter deeply embedded routines without degrading training effectiveness, reinforcing the structural nature of the intelligence trap. Deception efforts introduced during this period often focused on masking intent rather than capability, seeking to obscure which scenarios were considered most relevant while still exercising forces realistically. But these efforts frequently produced ambiguous signals that intelligence analysts could exploit by comparing exercise behavior to known operational requirements. Intelligence services also learned to exploit logistical and administrative indicators associated with exercises, such as fuel consumption, transportation bottlenecks, and reserve activation patterns. which were harder to disguise and often more revealing than tactical maneuvers. These indicators allowed observers to assess sustainment capacity and endurance, critical factors in evaluating whether an exercise represented mere signaling or genuine readiness for prolonged operations. The danger inherent in this dynamic became increasingly apparent as exercises occasionally triggered reciprocal responses that escalated beyond initial intent, forcing political leaders to rely heavily on intelligence assessment to determine whether observed activity reflected preparation for conflict or routine training. Intelligence agencies thus played a dual role, exploiting exercises for information while simultaneously acting as stabilizers, providing context and reassurance to prevent misinterpretation. This duality underscored the paradox of exercises as intelligence traps, as the very activity that generated insight also created risk, requiring careful management to avoid unintended escalation. By the late 1970s, military exercises were widely understood within strategic planning circles as moments of heightened vulnerability and opportunity, where intelligence gains could be substantial, but miscalculation equally costly. This understanding influenced decisions about exercise timing, scale, and transparency, leading to deliberate variation intended to balance readiness, signaling, and stability. Despite these efforts, the intelligence trap could not be closed, as realistic training inevitably produced observable behavior that adversaries could analyze, ensuring that exercises remained among the most important and contested sources of intelligence throughout the Cold War. This period demonstrated that the intelligence value of exercises lay not in dramatic revelations, but in cumulative insight, as repeated observation over time allowed adversaries to build increasingly accurate models of each other's military systems, decision-making processes, and tolerance for risk, shaping strategic expectations long before any actual conflict occurred. As the late 1970s moved into the early 1980s, the intelligence trap created by military exercises became increasingly dangerous as strategic warning timelines shortened and the margin for misinterpretation narrowed because advances in mobility, readiness, and command automation meant that the observable gap between exercise activity and real-world preparation continued to shrink. Intelligence services were now tasked not only with extracting information from exercises, but with determining whether an exercise was masking a transition to operational intent, a judgment that carried immense consequences if wrong. Analysts scrutinized exercise triggers, force, alert levels, and deviations from established patterns with heightened sensitivity, recognizing that adversaries might exploit routine maneuvers to conceal preparatory steps for real action, while also understanding that overreaction to training activity could itself provoke escalation. This ambiguity turned exercises into intelligence traps, not merely because they revealed information, but because they forced adversaries to make assumptions under uncertainty, exposing their thresholds for alarm and restraint. Military planners were aware of this risk and increasingly attempted to bracket exercises within political signaling designed to reassure, such as advance notification, diplomatic briefings, or adherence to agreed transparency measures. Yet these efforts did not eliminate suspicion, as intelligence services remained focused on detecting anomalies that might indicate deception or intent. The coexistence of reassurance and concealment created a complex signaling environment in which the same activity could be interpreted simultaneously as benign training and as potential preparation, depending on analytic perspective and prior expectation. Intelligence agencies therefore invested heavily in pattern-of-life analysis, comparing each exercise against historical baselines to identify subtle shifts that might indicate doctrinal change, readiness adjustment, or internal stress, treating even small deviations as potential indicators requiring explanation. Exercises involving rapid mobilization, reinforcement of forward positions, or heightened command participation were particularly sensitive as they tested the boundary between rehearsal and readiness, and intelligence observers closely monitored whether such actions were reversed promptly or left partially in place after the exercise concluded. The duration and demobilization phase of exercises thus became as important as their initiation, as failure to return to baseline could suggest preparation rather than practice. Command post exercises continued to offer insight into decision-making tempo and delegation, as observers inferred how quickly simulated crises escalated through command hierarchies and whether political authorities remained actively involved, information critical to assessing how real crises might unfold. Intelligence services also exploited exercises to assess adversary crisis management culture, noting whether responses emphasized caution, speed, or decentralization, and integrating these observations into broader models of escalation behavior. The intelligence trap deepened further as exercises increasingly incorporated realistic logistics, reserve call-ups, and interagency coordination, exposing the full depth of national mobilization capacity in ways that were difficult to conceal. These elements revealed not only military capability, but political willingness to mobilize society under simulated threat, providing insight into the credibility of deterrence beyond force structure alone. The risk of miscalculation during this period was heightened by the cumulative nature of observation, as repeated exposure conditioned analysts to expect certain behaviors, potentially blinding them to genuine change, or, conversely, amplifying concern when behavior deviated unexpectedly. Intelligence agencies sought to mitigate this risk by emphasizing alternative hypotheses and red-teaming analytic judgments. Yet the pressure to provide clear assessments under time constraint remained intense. Exercises thus became intelligence traps, not only for the observed, but for the observers themselves, as preconceived models could shape interpretation as strongly as raw data. Political leaders relied heavily on intelligence assessments during major exercises, using them to decide whether to raise alert levels, issue diplomatic warnings, or maintain restraint, placing intelligence agencies at the center of crisis management, even in the absence of real conflict. This reliance underscored the paradox that exercises designed to improve readiness could simultaneously erode stability by generating ambiguous signals that demanded interpretation. By the early 1980s, the intelligence trap inherent in military exercises was widely acknowledged within strategic circles as one of the most persistent sources of Cold War risk. Yet it was also accepted as unavoidable because realistic training could not be abandoned without degrading deterrence credibility. The challenge therefore shifted from avoidance to management, as states sought to design exercises that preserved training value while minimizing the likelihood of catastrophic misinterpretation. This balance was never fully achieved, but the effort itself shaped how exercises were planned, observed, and analyzed, embedding intelligence considerations permanently into what might otherwise have remained purely military routines. The evolution of exercises during this period demonstrated that in a highly surveilled, strategic environment, even rehearsals for war could function as tests of perception and restraint, making them among the most consequential intelligence arenas of the Cold War. As the early to mid-1980s progressed, the intelligence trap created by military exercises reached its most acute form as both superpowers confronted the convergence of heightened readiness, compressed warning timelines, and deeply entrenched analytic expectations, creating conditions in which the margin between exercise and escalation narrowed to a point that demanded constant interpretive discipline. Intelligence services increasingly treated major exercises as stress tests, not only of military capability, but of strategic stability itself, scrutinizing how political leaders, command systems, and alliance partners behaved when confronted with ambiguous but consequential activity. Analysts focused intensely on deviations from established exercise templates, recognizing that even minor changes in sequencing, command participation, or force posture could signal either doctrinal evolution or deliberate deception, and the difficulty lay in distinguishing adaptation from preparation. Exercises conducted during periods of broader political tension carried particular weight, as intelligence observers assessed whether training activity aligned with diplomatic posture or contradicted it, using inconsistency as a potential indicator of hidden intent. Military planners, aware of this scrutiny, attempted to maintain continuity in exercise design to avoid alarming adversaries. Yet, the need to test new concepts, integrate emerging technologies, and adapt to changing threat perceptions made stasis impractical, ensuring that some degree of novelty was unavoidable. This inevitability reinforced the intelligence trap, as adversaries interpreted innovation through the lens of risk rather than experimentation. Command and control exercises during this period revealed how deeply exercises had become embedded in escalation management, as observers inferred how authority was delegated, how quickly simulated crises moved through decision chains, and whether restraint mechanisms were emphasized or bypassed under pressure. These observations fed directly into intelligence assessments of adversary reliability and risk tolerance, shaping expectations for real-world crisis behavior. Exercises involving nuclear-capable forces were particularly fraught, as they combined high visibility with existential stakes, forcing intelligence agencies to weigh the possibility that routine drills could mask readiness changes intended to exploit surprise. The response to this uncertainty was not uniform, as some assessments emphasized caution and restraint, while others warned against complacency, highlighting the subjective element inherent in interpreting exercises as intelligence signals. Political leaders relied heavily on these assessments to decide whether to elevate alert levels, issue diplomatic signals, or maintain normal posture, placing extraordinary responsibility on intelligence interpretation during periods of routine military activity. The intelligence trap thus extended beyond military organizations to encompass political decision-making, as exercises created recurring moments when leaders had to choose between assuming benign intent and preparing for worst-case scenarios. Efforts to reduce this risk through transparency measures, advance notification, and confidence-building agreements reflected recognition of the danger. Yet these measures were limited in scope and effectiveness, as they could not eliminate ambiguity without undermining the training value of exercises themselves. Intelligence services adapted by emphasizing comparative analysis, weighing current exercises against long-term patterns and adversary political behavior to avoid overreaction. But the pressure to provide timely judgments under uncertainty remained intense. The cumulative effect of repeated exercises also shaped institutional expectations, as analysts developed mental models of adversary behavior that could both inform and constrain interpretation, reinforcing the danger that surprise might be discounted or exaggerated, depending on prior experience. By the mid-1980s, military exercises were widely regarded within intelligence and policy circles as among the most dangerous moments of peacetime competition, precisely because they combined realism, visibility, and ambiguity in ways that forced adversaries to interpret intent without clear signals. This recognition did not diminish the use of exercises, but it did embed intelligence analysis deeply into their planning and execution, as both sides sought to anticipate how actions would be read and to avoid triggering unintended escalation. The intelligence trap inherent in exercises thus became self-reinforcing, as each iteration added to the body of data-shaping expectations, while simultaneously creating new opportunities for misinterpretation. This phase demonstrated that the greatest risk posed by exercises was not that they revealed too much, but that they compelled adversaries to decide how much uncertainty they were willing to tolerate, making exercises central to the management of fear, perception, and restraint in the final decade of the Cold War. In the final assessment of how military exercises became intelligence traps during the Cold War, the historical record shows that these activities evolved into some of the most consequential and least controllable arenas of strategic interaction, precisely because they combined realism, visibility, and ambiguity in ways that forced adversaries to interpret intent without definitive proof. From the early post-war period through the final decade of superpower rivalry, exercises functioned not merely as rehearsals for conflict, but as recurring intelligence events in which both sides learned about capabilities, command behavior, escalation thresholds, and risk tolerance through sustained observation. The intelligence trap lay not only in what exercises revealed about forces and doctrine, but in how they compelled adversaries to react, exposing analytic assumptions, collection priorities, and political sensitivities in the process. Over time, repeated observation transformed exercises into long-term baselines against which change was measured, making even minor deviations strategically significant and increasing the danger that novelty would be misread as preparation. Intelligence agencies became central actors in this dynamic, exploiting exercises for insight while simultaneously working to prevent misinterpretation from triggering escalation, placing them at the intersection of collection and crisis management, even in peacetime. Military planners, for their part, accepted that exercises could not be insulated from intelligence scrutiny without sacrificing realism, leading to a strategy of management rather than concealment that sought to balance training value, signaling, and stability. Attempts to use exercises deliberately as probes or signals further deepen the intelligence trap, as adversaries learn to treat all large-scale maneuvers as potential tests of perception rather than benign activity. The convergence of advanced surveillance, compressed warning timelines, and entrenched analytic expectations in the late Cold War made exercises especially dangerous, as the line between routine training and escalation-ready posture became increasingly thin. Confidence-building measures and transparency initiatives reduced but did not eliminate this risk, as they could not resolve the fundamental ambiguity inherent in realistic military activity conducted under conditions of mutual suspicion. The enduring lesson of Cold War exercises is that intelligence competition does not require secrecy to be effective, but can thrive in full view when behavior itself becomes the object of analysis. Exercises demonstrated that even openly declared actions could function as intelligence traps by forcing adversaries to infer intent, assess risk, and decide how much uncertainty they were willing to tolerate. In this sense, exercises became mirrors as much as windows, revealing as much about the observers as the observed in shaping strategic expectations on both sides. By the end of the Cold War, military exercises stood as a reminder that the most dangerous moments of rivalry are often those labeled as routine, where the absence of clear hostile intent places the greatest burden on interpretation and restraint. The transformation of exercises into intelligence traps underscores a central reality of Cold War competition. That stability depended not on eliminating ambiguity, but on managing it through disciplined observation, cautious interpretation, and institutionalized restraint, even when rehearsing for the very conflicts all sides sought to avoid.